Hi there everyone, and welcome to this re-recording of the second lecture on typology for the Psychology of Work module. This session is designed to enhance your knowledge to answer your practice question. There's nothing examinable in terms of multiple choice questions within the content of this lecture. The purpose is really just to give you a stronger evidence base for which to develop any practice essay that you might be working on. So, as you know, the first place to start with any lecture that will help you revise for your examination are the module learning outcomes. And thus far we have extensively covered the content for these learning outcomes. But as I said, this lecture is designed to enhance your already existing knowledge. So we've covered the history and the development of the two major typology measures, the JTI, which is the Young Type Inventory, and the Myers-Briggs indicator. And you should now be able to discriminate between different facets of Young's counterbalancing of opposites theory, critically evaluate the theoretical background in the development of the Myers-Briggs measure of personality, understand the correct application of type measures in personality in industry, and critically evaluate the role of traditional psychometric criteria when evaluating typology. So your trial essay question, the practice that you have been set, is to write a position argument evidencing why typology measures have a role in psychology. And there are three possible approaches that you could adopt for this. This would be to create an argument for, against, or more work needed. The general purpose of this is that whatever argument you builds into a really strong directional conclusion. So that you can critically evaluate and explore literature within your essay, but what we want is you to come down on a very clear purpose at the end of the lecture. At the end of the essay. So you've been provided with some literature already, and these come from the Occupational Psychology Matters journal. The papers in it do tend towards a descriptive, informal argument against the measures in question. Carter, for example, is the opening paper, which offers a very descriptive, unevidenced argument. Haxon is similarly descriptive but offers an alternative argument. Craigie is still an opinion piece, but he does try to use more evidence to address the question. Now, you don't have the experience to draw upon to be able to write such informal pieces. Your work must be research-led. So don't copy those narrative styles. Don't fall into the trap of copying those narrative styles. We've got a little snippet here from part of one of the papers, which relates to the British Psychological Testing Centre and how they evaluate different tests. And it also said that these have been, evaluated as 3 or 4 star. In fact, you have copies of those reports as well, and vital to draw upon. You shouldn't copy the way in which the authors have addressed these issues, but you can say things like Craigie 2017 argues that, blah blah, for example. I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you in this session to show you how to actually seek out literature in a more effective and systematic way so that you can access the good papers to help you build your argument and hopefully realize that it isn't necessary for you to read absolutely everything that comes under your notice. In the first instance, I would strongly recommend staying away from things like Google Scholar. I know that they are very easy to use, but you tend to get an overwhelming amount of literature when you search for content. So the first example I have is how to get from one paper to another paper. It's called snowballing, really. The purpose is that you take a paper and you try and find another paper that is based on that paper. The Pittenger paper has been mentioned a few times throughout the sessions, and it is a good review of the utility of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, but it's very dated. It's dated 1993, so you really want to be trying to refresh that, adding something to the argument that's much more up to date. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I got from Pittenger to this Lohr book, which is in the library, and it's a library book that you can download as well. And particularly for you who are not really motivated perhaps by the theoretical background of work psychology, the principles still apply to all areas of psychology. And you can see that this is actually a clinical psychology textbook. Now, of course, it's a tall order to ask you to read another book, so I'm going to demonstrate to you how it's actually possible to find these resources and use these resources in an effective way without having to read every single component of the text. So when you go to the library catalogue, you'll see these different buttons, and what we want is databases. And when we get to databases, we want the PsycInfo button. You've also got PsycArticles and several other useful databases that you can use. For today, we're going to look at PsycInfo. And I've just here typed in the utility of the Myers-Briggs type indicator and then clicked search. And what you can see is that you get a list of titles, and in this case I've got the abstracts, and I've done that by going to page options and asking for a detailed result. And what I got here was this book. It's the second one that's been listed, Controversial and Questionable Assessment Techniques. I should also mention that prior to this screen I also made sure that I limited the publication date from 2010 so that I wouldn't get lots of different older papers that I'd have to work through. So remember to make sure that you use the limit button, which is on the left hand side, and you can limit your results by all sorts of things, including whether you want all results, whether you want books, or whether you want academic journals. So the next thing was to go and look for this textbook, and of course all of this is connected to the research library, so you can just click on the links and locate the document. This book in particular is a downloadable book from the library. But as I said, you don't want to be reading an entire book. So here we have the index list at the end, and we can see that the authors just talk about the Myers-Briggs industry in page 67. And there's a bit of an overview as well. When you read through that, you'll find that most of what they're saying relates to aspects around how the test should be administered and the training and the quality that surrounds the actual purposeful use of the test. So immediately, rather than just having a descriptive piece about test users being appropriately trained, deciding on the correct utility of the test, you can add Lohr et al. 2015 as a piece of evidence to support the argument, so it becomes less descriptive and more evidence-based. And you've done that for very little effort, really, just to locate that particular citation. The next thing that I've done is a Scopus search, which is slightly different, but again, accessible from the database buttons. And I've used various different search terms. In this case, this initial example is just Myers-Briggs, to try and determine what papers are available through this particular search engine, because sometimes you'll get different facilities in different search engines. So when the list of papers arrives in Scopus, you can do some interesting things with the results. And so, for example, here you can see that Scopus will keep a list of all of the things that you've searched for. You can see that there was 994 articles that just talked about Myers-Briggs. And then I start to limit it by publication year, subject area, which was psychology, and so on and so forth, as I try to work through to get something that's actually much more useful in nature. Going back to this particular one at the start, I actually thought it'd be interesting to see how many academics are actually using Myers-Briggs within research at the moment, to determine if the bad press around Myers-Briggs had actually impacted on the extent to which academics are prepared to use it, because you get quite a lot of narrative within newspaper reports, etc., that Myers-Briggs isn't used in psychology, but actually you really want to have some evidence to back that up rather than just general statements. So in the Scopus search, basically, you can ask it to analyse the results. There's an analyse results button, and it will break down whatever you've limited it to. So in this case, it's from 2007, how many papers were actually published using Myers-Briggs as a piece of research. And you can see this particular graph. Now you should ignore the 2017 citations because they haven't arrived yet, but you can see there's been a real drop-off of publications using this particular measure. You can also see that the numbers of publications are quite small generally. Now, I wanted to compare this with a more mainstream measure within psychology, a more mainstream measure of personality, to determine, what is the evidence that actually psychologists aren't using this particular instrument. So you should all be aware of the Costa-McCrae Big Five paper, and you can see both the number of documents per year and in the pattern of use. There's been a bit of a decrease during 2015, but generally it's only up. People are quite content to use the Big Five, sometimes also called the Ocean measure, but it's Costa-McCrae's paper that we're fundamentally talking about. You can also see here how I limited the search for publication year, etc., to get to this data. The third thing that I wanted to do was try and find some hard evidence that the papers used in industry largely, or what kinds of areas use the Myers-Briggs paperwork. Where are the different areas that it tends to be used? For this, I've gone to Science Direct. I've gone to the Science Citation Index, or Science Direct would also work quite well for you in this. And again, I've just put in the search terms Myers-Briggs review this time, because a review, as I said in the lecture, is a great thing if you can get a hold of it, because it really tries to cover everything and it gives you lots of information. And what I find is evidence of a number of different areas where Myers-Briggs is being used that I can cite within my essay without having to go to the trouble of reading every single paper in detail. I can pull out things like using the Myers-Briggs in different environments. So you can see here we've got teacher personality traits, etc. We've got some aspects on psychometric testing, etc. Suicidality is here, but you'll see many, many more examples if you attempt to search in this way. Within this search, I also found a paper by Adrian Furnham, which was published in 1996. This is an older paper, but I know that Adrian Furnham is an eminent psychometrician. So with my experience, I guess they probably would have done something on the Myers-Briggs inventory. And yes, indeed he had. And he had actually examined that there was a strong relationship between the Myers-Briggs type indicator and the Big Five Neo-PI measure. There are clear overlaps between the two. So if there are so many overlaps, it does beg the question, why then